In the grand theater of Congress, political narcissism is both playwright and star, a self-absorbed maestro conducting a symphony of dysfunction, where every note bends toward personal aggrandizement. Alliances form not from shared values but from the gravitational pull of ambition, as legislators cluster around rising stars to bask in their reflected glow. Yet these alliances are less coalitions and more cliques, united by vanity rather than vision. What masquerades as coexistence is often just parallel egos occupying the same room, spinning their own narratives without ever harmonizing. The result? A fragmented ecosystem where everyone's performing their own monologue while the machinery of governance rusts from disuse. Attempts at equilibrium fare no better. Every compromise is spun as an existential betrayal, every yes vote a potential dagger to ideological purity. When factional leaders veto progress to preserve their own image, the legislative process becomes a game of brinkmanship, a standoff where checks and balances give way to checkmate and collapse. The notion of governance as a collective act erodes in the face of narcissists who equate winning with obstruction, as if dysfunction itself were proof of ideological superiority. Reinforcement, too, is warped into something grotesque. When a representative's incendiary soundbite goes viral, their allies don't engage with the policy implications, they celebrate the theater. Their cheerleading creates a feedback loop of performative validation where the loudest voice, not the sharpest mind, sets the agenda. Meanwhile, the opposition responds not with reflection but with reflexive defensiveness. Reports of inefficiencies and failures become fodder for conspiracy theories rather than catalysts for course correction. Criticism is reframed as sabotage, reflection is dismissed as weakness. Narcissistic leaders surround themselves with mirrors rather than windows, ensuring that all they see is their own righteousness reflected back. At the heart of this dysfunction is the causal cycle of narcissistic leadership. A self-styled savior rises, claiming personal credit for every legislative victory while deflecting blame for every setback. Their press conferences are sermons of self-praise, their policies thin veneers stretched over gaping voids of substance, and when they fall, or step aside, intoxicated by their own myth, their successor arrives loudly proclaiming themselves the antidote while replicating every egocentric tick of their predecessor. The names change, but the pattern repeats. One self-anointed messiah is simply replaced by another as the nation watches a rerun of the same tragic farce. Narcissism's chaos isn't always linear either. Sometimes the entire agenda is hijacked by a trending scandal or viral outrage. Long-term priorities vanish in the shadow of immediate optics as public fury dictates legislative focus. Today's outcry sets tomorrow's docket, even if yesterday's crisis remains unsolved. Policy becomes reactive spectacle, an improvisational scramble for relevance in a 24-hour news cycle. And when the frenzy subsides and failure becomes undeniable, the retrospective should invite introspection. But instead of accountability, we get press briefings saturated with deflection. It's never the policymaker's fault, it's the media, the opposition, the narrative. Mistakes are treated as acts of cosmic betrayal rather than human error. Inclusion, too, is perverted. Gatekeepers form exclusive inner circles, allowing entry only to those who parrot the party line or flatter their ambitions. Innovative thinkers who refuse to play sycophant are sidelined, left to shout from the margins. The promise of diverse representation is hollowed out by petty gatekeeping, and where inclusion is denied, exclusivity flourishes. Power is hoarded by the few who wield it like a velvet rope, deciding which voices are allowed into the conversation and which are condemned to irrelevance. Decisions of national consequence are shaped not by collective wisdom but by cliques fortified by vanity and tribalism. Even when factions attempt to cooperate, their conjoined efforts collapse under the weight of their own egos. Instead of celebrating collective progress, leaders demand individual credit, refusing to share the spotlight. And so negotiations stall, not over policy but over pride. Legislative progress is held hostage by leaders determined to brand every bipartisan effort as their personal triumph, or kill it if the credit cannot be solely theirs. Worse yet, bills are hijacked by unrelated demands, selfish riders that transform necessary reforms into battlegrounds for petty leverage. In this world, empathy is treated as weakness. Efforts to harmonize differing perspectives are derided as betrayal. Legislators who dare to compromise are painted as traitors by their more radical peers, who peddle dissonant narratives designed to deepen tribalism. Nuance becomes dangerous, bipartisanship treasonous. The most polarizing voices drown out the moderates, dragging discourse to its most divisive extremes. In this cacophony, harmony becomes impossible, replaced by a war of echo chambers where empathy is strangled by ambition. The inability to converge around a single unified proposal is no accident. It's a feature of narcissistic leadership. When every faction insists on its own draft, when the goal isn't to solve the crisis but to secure personal credit for the solution, unity dissolves into a patchwork of splintered initiatives that cancel each other out. This divergence leaves the public trapped in an endless loop of government shutdowns and legislative impasses, all of which are framed as principled stands rather than failures of governance. Even when policies are passed, their complexity is flattened into simplistic talking points, weaponized for campaign slogans and cable news quips. Months of negotiation are boiled down to hashtags and applause lines, as if a 1,000-page bill can be reduced to a 3-word chant. The nuanced substance of reform is sacrificed on the altar of self-promotion. Meanwhile, partisan actors frame these reforms as existential assaults on their constituents, using fear to galvanize their base and strengthen factional loyalty. Public debate becomes a marketplace of outrage where grievance is the only currency. Coalitions, too, are built on shaky foundations. Politicians enter into alliances not out of shared purpose, but out of mutual ego-stroking. These superficial associations disintegrate the moment clashing ambitions overtake temporary validation. And those who dissent from the party line are swiftly disassociated, stripped of influence, relegated to the sidelines. Moderates are isolated as their radical counterparts seize the narrative, dragging their parties deeper into ideological echo chambers. The consequences of this fragmentation are stark. Reform efforts splinter into piecemeal initiatives, each designed to boost individual reputations rather than achieve systemic improvements. What should be an integrated agenda for national progress becomes a disjointed collection of vanity projects. Public trust crumbles as the scandals, infighting, and performative outrage erode Congress's credibility. Disintegration is not an abstract concept. It is a lived reality where institutional coherence gives way to the chaos of unchecked ambition. In the end, political narcissism doesn't just impede governance, it corrodes democracy itself. It replaces collaboration with competition, accountability with deflection, and public service with personal branding. Restoring public trust requires more than policy tweaks. It demands a cultural reckoning. Until Congress shifts away from the cult of individualism and toward a culture of humility, transparency, and empathy, its legacy will remain a cautionary tale, a self-absorbed spectacle mistaken for a functioning government where leaders chase applause while the nation waits for solutions.